Hi there, welcome to the Bonsai Stuff podcast. I'm Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu. Love your company, thank you for listening in. I want to talk in this episode of the podcast about a thin trunk bonsai because I have a lot of people talk to me, how do I get my trunk nice and meaty? How do I get a really thick trunk, the size of my leg? What do I have to do? And they're the ones that I love. I think that the elegance of a slender trunk bonsai can sometimes be forgotten. So I want to talk about that and maybe sell to a lot of people as to why it's definitely beneficial to stick with keeping some of your trees having that slender trunk. And as age kicks in, yeah, sure, they look bloody brilliant. They look fantastic. But around the yard, like we're getting into autumn now, hopefully you've started fertilising by now. Hopefully your neighbours have started leaving nasty notes in your letterbox saying how your joint stinks. But hopefully your trees can get some of that food that they're desperately going to need during this period. You would have noticed the days are getting shorter, definitely. I've found the overnight temperatures are definitely getting lower. It's still warm through the days at times. It's still humid. We're getting a lot more rain around at the moment, which is definitely that change of season. It always seems to be a bit turbulent around the place in Melbourne when we change from one season to the next, as it is most places these days, I suppose, with the intensity of the storms that we get. But I've noticed that the grass is definitely growing again now with the drop in temperature overall. There are peaks, but there definitely is a drop in temperature. The daylight hours are still there, so this it's starting to get long and have to get mown far more frequently than what it did towards the end of summer. And I noticed that the yard trees are starting to drop their leaves, so it means that fertilising, all those things that I see around the yard make me very, very mindful that the trees that we've got in these little pots need some attention and need some fertilising and need to be looked after at this time, because it is a growing period that's starting. You might not feel like it is because there isn't too much happening around the trees at this early part, but it definitely is. And looking around your yard and seeing different things, when you go for a walk, you'll notice that things are starting to get long and shaggy and greener, more lush again, and it means that we need to be on top of it. But anyway, this podcast is designed to hopefully sell the notion to you that thin trunk bonsai is okay, that it's elegant, that it's classy, that doesn't need to have 1,000,001 sacrifice branches for the next 150 years to make it something that it will never possibly be, and maybe sticking with something that's there. I'll give you a few guidelines, a few pointers, I suppose, that will help keep things in connectivity with that trunk that you've got, with your foliage size and all that sort of stuff. And we can start having some thin trunk bonsais that get put on display that everyone will love. All right, let's get into it. Let's call this podcast the When Less Is More podcast because it's true. Now, don't get out of your head the thought that thin trunk means literati. And if you don't know what literati is and you're listening to the podcast, just jump on the internet and have a quick look. It's sort of light, elegant, wispy trunks with foliage pads coming off it. Yep, sure, it definitely is. But I don't want that to necessarily be the only thought that comes into your head when you start thinking about a thin trunk on a bonsai. It's not the only option that you've got. I've seen some magnificent formal upright trees that have got very light foliage structure and very thin trunks. Looks fantastic. Doesn't need to be 30 centimeters across at the base to really make you stop and look at it. And I learnt that when I was in Japan at Aichien. There was beautiful, there's so many big thick trees that you sort of go, wow, like they're just amazing. There's so much to see. And then all of a sudden you come across a thinner trunk tree, and some of the guys that were there that with far more experience than what I had at the time would sort of say, now look at this tree, look at the elegance of it, look at the simplicity, look at this, look at that. And it's like, oh, wow. I'd had that driver in my head that it's got to be big, it's got to be meaty, it's got to be, a 3-person lift to make it a decent bonsai. It's not true at all. It can definitely have the lighter trunk and still be something which is very attractive and suits bonsai, suits pot culture. There's a lot of factors that go into a thinner trunk bonsai. I think it makes it far harder to get it right than if you've got this big meaty trunk. And I started thinking about this podcast and what I'd talk about with thin trunks, because it's a repetitive question that I get asked, and I see it all the time in the workshop. And when I'm with people, it's like, okay, how do I get this bigger? It's like, okay, so thin trunks are extremely common. They are. That's the way that they're grown. They can churn out through the bonsai nurseries and in your backyard a bit quicker, having a thinner trunk, and so they're very, very common. Doesn't mean that everything in your collection has to have a thin trunk, but they are common, and I'm certain that everyone listening to this will say, yeah, well, I've got this tree or I've got that tree, and its trunk probably isn't as thick as what I'd like it to be. Don't shut the door on it. Let's start thinking about making these thin trunks something beautiful. And thin trunk doesn't mean that it's a sign of being young. We talked about bark. I talk about bark a lot. It's funny. Anyway, so bark is one of those things that comes with age on the tree, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a thin trunk tree or it's a thick trunk tree. That bark, when it starts to appear and starts to flake off and starts to build or plate or whatever the variety of tree does, it starts to really add to the elegance and the show of age that these trees have. And that word elegant, it keeps coming to mind, and you'll hear it a lot through this podcast. That's exactly what I think of when I see a beautifully structured thin trunk tree, not always literati where it's showing barely holding on for life, but when I see the nature of a thin trunk tree that's really well built, the word elegance just pops into mind. And that's when we think about all of it, we're going to talk about pots and stuff like that a little bit later on that go with them, but everything that goes with a thin trunk bonsai comes back to elegance, to fine detail, to making sure that everything is perfect. And it's, like I said earlier, it's very hard to get that balance, the nature of balance for the trunk to the foliage to the pot correct, and to maintain it on a thin trunk tree. They want to push out. And when I say thin trunk, I'm not talking about young tree. I'm not going to use the word young. I'm just going to use that thin trunk as something that can be something that we strive for with older trees. It doesn't need to be poofy. The trouble that I come across a lot, one of the major issues that I see with thin trunk trees, thin trunk bonsai, is the overpowering nature of the foliage. So we'll talk about the visual weight again. It's something that I believe very strongly in, is when you not the physical weight, obviously, it's the visual weight. So if you compare, you break it into segments, break the trunk into one segment and look at that and say, does that, with your horse blinkers on where you're ignoring everything else, you look at the trunk, what sort of weight does it look like that trunk can hold? What sort of foliage mass can that trunk hold and still support itself in the real world? And if it's really super thin, well, really the foliage mass can't be too much. Otherwise, that tree is going to bend and sway and get too heavy, and just it's not going to be viable. So by then breaking into look at the apex that rolls with the thinner trunk tree, it's like, okay, so the size apex that you've got, does it look like the visual weight of that apex is suitable for that trunk? 95% of the time when I see a thin trunk bonsai, I'd always say that apex has got to come in. It's got to definitely come back into proportion. That there's no way that you can have a big football sitting on top of a matchstick, because it's not going to be able to support itself, and it looks weird, like it looks incorrect. And this is where the focus turns to thickening the trunk to suit the foliage mass, as opposed to adjusting the foliage mass to suit the trunk, which is far easier to achieve, and it's desirable. It's not undesirable being thin. So then I would start working on my physical width of my apex and the shape of my apex as well, and start bringing that in. Look at what needs to be removed. Look at what needs to come off. Look at what visually needs to be removed so the weight of that foliage of the apex, I forget the branches for now, but just that weight of that apex comes in. Get a tape measure and look at the trunk and go, okay, well, the trunk sort of at the thickest point is 3 centimeters, 5 centimeters, whatever it is. Work your way up to the top of the tree and go, okay, well, if it's sort of 3 centimeters at the base, then the apex really can't be much more than, say, 5 centimeters at its widest point. Coming up to the top of the dome or the top of the point or whatever, top of the apex. When you work your way down that apex, if you've got a sort of 3 centimeter trunk, then 5 centimeters is sort of the cap. And if you've got a 7 centimeter trunk, then maybe 9, 10 centimeters might be about the width. There's no absolutes. There's no exact. There's no cookie cutter. I love that term. There's no cookie cutter design for these things, but you've got to have some kind of a starting point for working out, saying, okay, well, what is too heavy and what is acceptable? What sort of brings that tree back into line? Take a photo on your phone and get in there and adjust the photo to bring it back in at the apex. Start at that point. Shade it in on the sides and look at it and go, yeah, well, that actually looks right. And just keep moving it in further and further from the tips, from the extremities of the width of the apex. Start working it back into the point where you go, actually, that looks better. Maybe it needs to come down a little bit in height as well, whatever it's going to be. The shape of your apex is very important, but it's more the width that I find that drawing out mushroom shape of the top of the apex that can really make it appear way too heavy. And using a tool on your phone where you can shade it in, colour it in, black, get rid of it, whatever the colour of the background is that you've taken the photo on, just work it in so you can then go, well, okay, there's my starting point. And then, zoom in on the photo, have a look and see where it's been cut to. Maybe then start, put a little flag or a bit of wire or something like that, just a loop on the branches on the apex at that point and go, well, okay, that's going to be the width of my apex. And then, coming down, they don't always have to meet a triangle shape. Your trees don't have to. Like it might be a diamond shape where it goes out, widest branches are in the middle, and then it comes back in at the base to your lower branches being smaller and in closer. It might be that it's a triangle. Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. But if you're looking at your tree, you've got to take into account the flow of the tree, which way it's going to moving right to the left, or whatever it's doing. You'll have your compaction side, the shorter side against the flow. You'll have your extension side, your longer side going with the flow of the tree. Just start roughly drawing some lines. Get a ruler. Again, it doesn't have to suit this shape. I'm just trying to help you visualize where the width or the visual excess mass of the foliage needs to start being removed to come in. And you don't have to have them where they're a perfect triangle shape. I'm just trying to help you visualize and see that there's going to be a line when you work your way down that foliage from the new apex line that you've worked on. Following that down right to the very lowest branch, you'll start to then see that the line needs to come in a lot heavier. You'll start to see that foliage on the side of your thin trunk bonsai really starts to move in a little bit closer and closer and closer to take away that weight that you're dealing with. And like I said, it doesn't need to be a literati. It can be a very formal style tree. It can be an informal upright with the light, elegant movement. Where they fail in my mind is when those foliage pads get to be too long, too big, too heavy. So we talked about breaking foliage pads apart a few episodes ago in the podcast. That's exactly what I would be doing. Rather than necessarily looking at a branch, you've got your ruler, you've got your line, you see that it's sticking out too far. Yeah, I haven't even mentioned getting your branch cutters or scissors out yet. Get that pad that's sticking out too far, look at it and go, okay, well, how can I break that apart? How can I take it from one heavy pad to break it apart? Can I do it into 2 pads and then maybe shorten it? Can I break it into 3 pads maybe and really make it far more interesting and then shorten them and lighten those foliage pads up? So rather than the pad being, for example, the size of your hand when you open up your fingers, make it that it's the pads are the size of when you bring your first finger and your thumb together, like that circle that you make. Can your pads become that size as opposed to the size of your palm? They're the things that will, you're still going to have foliage mass, so visibly it's going to look like it's still taking up the shape that you've got, but then you suddenly get a visually lighter foliage mass that you can work with, where you've got that break of space, you see more branch structure, you see more negative space where you get drawn into it. It becomes far more interesting and doesn't look like the tree's going to topple over to one side because the foliage pad's so heavy on one side of the tree. I think that they're the sort of things that you've got to start to work with these thin trunk trees. All right, time for a bit of a break. Bonsai containers, and I'll use the word container as opposed to pot because there's so many different options that you can have. I've seen beautiful, elegant, see there's that word again, slender trunk bonsai that are on a slab that look fantastic because you got maybe a thin piece of stone, whatever it is. Maybe not the widest, the deepest. Maybe the root mass is contained to one part of the stone as opposed to going edge to edge on it. So they can look very nice. It can look very classy, and the choice of pot is just as important as the width of the foliage or the size of the pad or the diameter of the apex. The wrong pot can become overpowering for the tree and make the tree start to look like it's lost at sea, like it's got no link. It's just in a container for whatever reason it's growing. It's looking after the root mass, whatever it is. But when you start thinking about visual weight of the foliage mass, start doing the same thing when it comes to the container. Look at that. Look at the foliage mass. And your phone's great. You can get photos. You can impose another pot on front of it. You can just hold a pot in front of it. But look at maybe a shallower pot. Maybe it can have something. There's some beautiful, light, elegant. There's that word. There's some really classy, smaller lipped pots. There's pots with big lips on them as well. The rim around the top, the lip of the pot can be quite wide. They can be shallow. And you can really get that magnificent tree in there, and the pot can really add to the design of the tree and really take it to another level. Getting something that's big and deep and super wide and just ugly. It's just overpowering for that tree. Might be a nice short-term temporary thing that we can do to get the tree to the next stage, but I'll guarantee you that do some research, jump on the internet, Google thin trunk bonsai, whatever. Start looking at the images from the shows and just see how they are positioned in the pot, how they really tell a story. They really go with the design of the tree and add to it. They don't detract from it. And if you find photos, keep an eye on the pots, because sometimes they can really destroy is a strong word, but they can really detract from or take away from the feel of the tree. Put your hand over the picture where you've got the big heavy pot at the bottom and look at just the tree by itself, and then put the two together and go, well, that pot's just the wrong pot. And sometimes you don't, you're repotting. I get it. You go through your collection. I don't have a pot that's going to suit this. Aim for the best pot you can possibly get. Aim for the right pot that's going to suit the thickness of the trunk. So, there's no hard and fast rule with it, but for me, the approach that I use, very simple. The thinner the trunk, the shallower the pot. That's it. I can still have wide pots. I don't think that, like I talked about with the slab, I've seen a lot of light, elegant bonsai that are in quite wide pots, but it's the depth of the pot that really starts to overpower, starts to destroy that nature of the thin trunk bonsai. So there's a balance. I suppose that's the best word to use with any bonsai. There's balance between the trunk, between the trunk and the apex, the trunk, the apex, and the foliage. And the trunk, the apex, the foliage, and the pot. They've all got to work together. And if you can keep that in mind, and it doesn't have to happen straight away, but it's got to be the goal, it's got to be the target, it's got to be the plan going forward, 1, 2, 5, 10 years, whatever it is down the track. Any of your trees, that balance has got to be taken into consideration, and that's the key to success. That's the key to making a brilliant bonsai is balancing, and that balance applies to every single tree that you've got, whether it's 1.5 meters tall and the trunk's as big as your torso, or it's 20 centimeters tall and you're going for a very slender 10 millimeter trunk, something like that. It's all about the balance that comes between the two that really starts to hold out. But I just think that these thin trunk bonsai can be very difficult, very hard, and that's probably one of the main reasons why you don't see a hell of a lot of them, because it does take a lot of dedication and a lot of application of really good technique to get that perfection when it comes to the slender trunks. But and talking of the trunk too, like when it comes to the movement of a thin trunk bonsai, I find that stark, and I'm not talking about literati. All right, I know literati is different, but I'm just talking about any other variety or style of a thin trunk bonsai that you can consider. I'm just trying to open your mind to different possibilities, especially for something like a deciduous or a flowering variety. Something along those lines might suit this styling, and just keep your options open. But the gentle flowing movement of an elegant thin trunk bonsai works really well. I don't for the lighter trunk. I don't. For me, and again, personal, you can do whatever you want. But for me, I find that the harsh movement, right angles, very, very, very intense bends on elegant trunks, that's probably not what I would be drawn to. I'd be drawn far more to something which has got a nice, gentle flow to it. A nice, going in a nice, gentle arc direction. You got talk about consistency of the bends and the angles throughout the whole tree, so you don't have gentle, elegant movement and then it gets harsh towards the top of the tree and then goes back to elegant again. It's like got to all work together. And one of the things that is, I talk about keys to success with bonsai, one of the biggest things, and it doesn't matter what size tree it is that you're working with, taper is very important. And working on taper on larger trunk trees, bigger, thicker trunk trees, that's okay. You can sort of work with it a lot easier. When it's a light, slender trunk, or it's a thinner trunk, it's so much harder to get that taper correct, because you might be, let's say I'll just throw some figures in, but let's say you're sort of working at a 40 centimetre or 50 centimetre tall bonsai, and the base of the tree is, say 4 centimetres across at the base, then you've only really got a very short distance to take that from 4 centimetres right the way up to, say, maybe 1 centimetre at the apex, and lighter as it branches out, of course. But you've only got maybe 30, 35 centimetres really of trunk to taper down that far, which can be quite hard to get. So the use of sacrifice branches and that can definitely be done while you're developing the trunk. In that the early stage one of any bonsai development is trunk and nabari. Same. It doesn't need to be a sacrifice branch that grows for 3.5 meters out the back of the tree. It can be one that maybe extends out, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 centimeters, and then it gets cut back. And then there's another one that grows 15, 20 centimeters, and then it gets cut back. So there's a lot more management of growth when it comes to thin trunk bonsai, and a lot more hard work. So you'll still use a lot of the techniques that we use for developing every other bonsai. It just means that when the tree has got that thinner trunk, that you need to be on top of it a lot more, because things can blow out pretty fast. And yeah, sure, your plan can change. It doesn't always have to be a thin trunk bonsai, but you might find the perfect one. Next time you go to to a bonsai nursery and you're having a hunt around, you might find one and go, look at that trunk. That is perfect taper from there to there. I've got buds in the right spots. I could really break that apart. Don't walk away from a thinner trunk bonsai, because they're beautiful and they're very hard to get. They're very rewarding. They definitely make me stop and look, because it's so easy to get it wrong. It's so easy to blow things out. When you've got less margin for error with your structure, they're the ones that draw me in, because when you get it right, it's so rewarding. It looks so good. It's so fantastic. So I think that, a couple of things, the trunk, just to reiterate, if you are wiring up young trees, then, really that's something that you've got to aim for. Don't go, if it's going to be a more slender trunk, I wouldn't go for harsher angles on the trunk. I would go for something far more elegant and gentle and smoother and consistent as it sort of flows up the tree. They don't always have to be literati style, so don't put that into your mind every time that you look at, you walk in, you might find for instance, a thin trunk maple or a thin trunk native. You don't have to suddenly go, well, okay, bang, literati is the only option that tree's got. It's like, no, well, okay, it can be formal upright, it can be a formal upright, it can be a slanting style, it can be whatever badge you want to put on it. They can be any of those, as long as the flow and directional movement of the tree works within that space for the tree. Doesn't have to have a chunky trunk to do it. But the size of the pads also make a massive difference. And, the more pads, smaller size, they always make a difference when it comes to the more elegant trees. I think regardless, the size of pads is a bit of a common thread for me at the moment for everything, because it's just something that, it sort of gets bunched together and everything becomes very large and very heavy, and the visual weight of stuff is always on my mind. And so talking about this classification of bonsai, the thin trunk bonsai, it's something we can all have in our collection. It's something that we can all work towards. It's not something that's easy. By all means, don't think because it's got a thin trunk it's going to be easy. I think it's actually probably going to be a little more difficult to maintain longer term. And things like the bud conveyor, being able to cut these longer branches back to something viable is necessary with the thinner trunk trees, because the trunk's not going to be growing, so the foliage pads can't keep getting longer and longer and longer. So you have to be doing everything absolutely correct when it comes to the thin trunk bonsai. But as I said, I think that they would be very rewarding, and they would make you stop and look at them when you walk past. All right, let's do a little bit of a recap on thin trunk bonsai. So they're elegant, they're desirable. They are definitely something that you should not shy away from, and that you should look to hone your skills on, because it does take a lot of skill to get them right. They suit a variety of styles. Don't pigeonhole yourself. Don't pigeonhole the tree into only fitting into one category of styling. They can be anything. It doesn't matter. But you've got to make sure that your pot selection is not overpowering for the tree. Again, that's really super important to make sure that part works with the tree. The trunk line is very important, very, very, very important for the tree, and the movement of the tree. So the flow, the directionality, and taper. The three keys to success with bonsai, they still apply. It doesn't change. So if you've got a thin trunk bonsai that is a sausage, it's the same thickness from top to bottom, it doesn't work. You've got to get taper. It's got to go from a thicker point at the base to a thinner point at the top. It doesn't need to go from a meter wide to 1 centimeter at the top. That's not the sort of thing. But it's still got to taper as you work your way up that trunk. So you've got to put a lot of effort into getting that part right. And the most important thing with all of your trees, but just with these slender, more thinner bonsai, it's balance. It's balance between the trunk, the foliage mass, the visual weight of the foliage, the size of your apex, the size of your pads. It's all got to, and the pot. It's all got to balance together. And the more that you work on them and the longer that you have them, you'll realise that it is difficult to get right. There'll be periods of time where they do balance, where you work on them and go, that's great, that looks fantastic. And then things will start to grow, things will start to change, things will start to get too long. Trees grow. That's what they do. We fertilise them, they push out more growth. So it's going to happen where you'll find that the tree won't maintain that structure that you want that was once perfectly in balance. That's okay. We fertilise them, we let sunlight and air into them, we have the bud conveyor working so we can cut things back further and reduce length and take off visual mass, and we can lighten the foliage up again and do the same thing, but that's okay. That's what they do. We get them perfect, they start to grow out, we push them back again, because horticulturally we look after these trees so we can maintain the artistic structure and design that we want long term, forever and ever and ever. The bark on the tree will come with age, so you will have, the feeling of age on a thin trunk bonsai. It doesn't need to be meaty to feel that age. So I'd think that if you look around your yard and see something that's got that elegant trunk on it, don't put in plans to say, okay, in 30 years' time that's going to be a beast because I'm going to run these sacrifice branches. Maybe keep it as a thin trunk bonsai, and you can walk around with a coffee in your hand and go, geez, that's elegant. Anyway, thanks for listening into the podcast. I appreciate the company. As I said, if you're not underway fertilising by now and you're in the southern part of Australia, then you're missing the opportunity to get into it. Your trees are going to love you for it and they're going to start taking off. So it's time to stink out the joint and apologise to your neighbours over the fence and say it's for the best of your bonsai. But do what you can. Again, fertilising is one of those things that I'm going to cover a little bit more in next episode, just because I do get asked around this time of the year about methodologies and reasonings and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to talk about that, and there's a little bit on some tube stock for next week as well, because it's another good time to start doing some work on that. All right, thanks for listening in. Have a great week in bonsai. You'll hear me again next week with another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. And until then, as always, happy bonsai.